Most people make the same mistake with cucumbers just a few days after planting them, and they do it because they want to help the plants grow faster. They take strong fertilizer or fresh manure and pour it around the young roots before those roots have even recovered from the move, and then they wonder why the cucumber stops growing instead of taking off. I made that mistake myself many years ago, and I still remember looking at a whole row of cucumbers that suddenly turned pale and weak, while the plants next door were already climbing. The worst part was that I thought they were hungry, so I fed them again, and that only made the problem worse. Cucumbers are different after transplanting because their roots need time to settle into the new soil before they can handle feeding properly. For the first several days, I do almost nothing except keep the soil reasonably warm and evenly moist and make sure the plants are protected from cold nights and excessive heat. I know that sounds too simple, especially when garden stores are full of bottles and powders promising faster growth. But an old gardener taught me something many years ago that I have never forgotten. He told me that a cucumber with shocked roots cannot eat properly, so feeding it too early is like giving a tired man a heavy meal when what he really needs is rest. Usually, I wait around 10 to 14 days after planting before I even think about the first feeding, but I never follow the calendar blindly. I look at the plant itself because it will tell me when it is ready. I want to see new leaves appearing after transplanting, the stem beginning to stretch again, and most importantly, those little tendrils starting to form near the leaf joints. That is the sign that the cucumber has started working again and is ready for gentle nutrition. And when I see that sign, I do not reach for the strongest fertilizer I can find. I use an old, simple feeding method that costs very little and can be made from something many gardeners already have at home. But there is one small detail about this first feeding that most people completely miss, and getting that detail right can make a surprising difference in how your cucumbers start the season. The biggest mistake people make with the first cucumber feeding is not choosing the wrong fertilizer, but choosing the right fertilizer at the wrong moment. I learned that after ruining a whole row of young cucumbers many years ago because I thought faster growth was always better. I had good soil, warm weather, and healthy seedlings, and I decided to give them a strong feeding only a few days after planting. I expected the leaves to become darker and the stems to start running up the support. Instead, the plants slowed down. Some lower leaves became pale and the stems seemed to stop moving. I kept thinking they needed even more food because that is how I was taught to think at the time. If a plant looks weak, then feed it, but cucumbers taught me a different lesson. After transplanting, the roots are still recovering and building new small roots in the soil. If you give them a heavy dose while they are in this condition, you can create more trouble than you solve. I have seen gardeners spend good money on special fertilizers and then lose weeks of growth because they were simply too eager. Most people do not notice the problem immediately either. That is what makes this mistake so dangerous. The cucumber may look acceptable for several days, and then the growth suddenly stops. The leaves can lose their healthy color and the gardener thinks the plant is hungry. So another feeding goes in, and the situation becomes even worse. An old neighbor once looked at my cucumbers during one of those seasons and told me something I still remember. He said, "Your cucumbers are not starving. They are shocked." That changed the way I feed plants. Now I watch instead of guessing. I want to see new leaves appearing after the transplant. I want the stem to start stretching again. And there is one little sign that I pay special attention to because it tells me the cucumber has really started growing again. Those small tendrils begin forming near the leaf joints and reaching for something to hold. When I see that happening together with fresh growth, I know the plant is waking up and can begin receiving gentle nutrition. Usually this is around 10 to 14 days after planting, but weather matters more than the calendar. Cold nights can delay everything, and feeding into cold, wet soil is something I avoid. I also avoid cold water because young cucumber roots do better with warm, steady conditions. The funny thing is that doing less during this period often saves more money and produces better plants than buying another bottle. But once the cucumber finally shows that it is ready, the question becomes very important. What should that first feeding actually be, so the plant gets enough help without being pushed too hard? The first feeding I use once the cucumber has clearly started growing again is an old method that costs almost nothing and does not require a shelf full of bottles. I use clean wood ash and warm water because this is one of those simple garden habits that was passed from one gardener to another long before there were special cucumber boosters for every stage of growth. My grandfather used ash in the garden, and I remember seeing an old bucket sitting beside the shed every spring. At the time, I never thought much about it, but after many years of growing cucumbers, I understand why he trusted it. I take about 1 glass of sifted ash from clean untreated wood and put it into a bucket of warm water. I let it stand for about a day so the useful part of the ash moves into the water, and then I stir it gently before using it. I do not pour it over the leaves, and I do not dump dry ash around the stem. I water the soil lightly first if it is dry, and only then give the ash water around the root area. For a young cucumber, I keep the amount modest and use about 1 cup of the prepared liquid around each plant. That is enough for the first feeding. Most gardeners make the mistake of thinking that if a little helps, then twice as much must help twice as much, with cucumbers that can quickly become a problem. The goal of this first feeding is not to force the plant into wild growth, but to give it gentle support while the roots are becoming active again. Ash provides potassium and calcium, along with small amounts of other minerals, and the old method was especially useful when gardeners wanted something simple that they could make from what was already around the farm. But there is one detail that matters more than the ash itself. Never put ash feeding onto completely dry soil because the roots of a young cucumber are still sensitive, and dry soil combined with concentrated material can cause trouble. I learned to moisten the soil first and feed afterward, and that small change made my results much more reliable. I also never mix ash with fresh manure or strong nitrogen feeding at the same time, because trying to make one super fertilizer from 5 different ingredients usually creates more problems than it solves. Most people never realize that simple feeding can be stronger than complicated feeding when the timing is right. And there is another old method I use when I want to give the cucumbers a little more growth later, but that one has a very easy mistake that can turn healthy vines into nothing but leaves. The part I want you to remember is that the first feeding is not about making the cucumber grow as fast as possible. It is about giving the plant a small amount of support at the moment when the roots are finally ready to use it. I learned to think about it this way after years of trying different fertilizers and watching what happened afterward. Once I see fresh leaves appearing, the stem stretching again and those tiny tendrils beginning to form, I know the plant has moved past the worst part of the transplant shock. That is when I prepare the ash water. I use only ash from clean, untreated wood because I do not want painted wood or other materials anywhere near my vegetable garden. I sift the ash first, so the larger pieces stay out of the bucket. Then I take about 1 glass of ash and add it to a bucket of warm water. I let it stand for about 1 day, and then I stir it again before using it. The water will look gray and cloudy, and that is perfectly normal. I do not try to make it look clean or clear, because this is an old, simple garden preparation, and it does not need to be pretty. Then comes the part where most gardeners get impatient. I do not pour it quickly around the stem, and I never splash it over the leaves. I water slowly around the root area, and for the first feeding I use about 1 cup of the prepared liquid for each young cucumber plant. That is enough. More is not better here. The goal is to give the plant gentle support while it is building new roots and beginning active growth. The ash provides potassium, calcium, and small amounts of other minerals, and this is one reason old gardeners kept a bucket of wood ash close to the garden instead of throwing it away. It cost them nothing, and they could use what was already available from the stove or fireplace. But there is one detail I learned to take seriously. If the soil is completely dry, I moisten it first and wait before giving the ash water. I do not want a young root system sitting in dry soil and then receiving a concentrated feeding all at once. This small step costs nothing, but it makes the whole process calmer for the plant. And there is another thing I never combine with this first feeding. I do not add fresh manure water or several strong fertilizers together, because I have learned that complicated mixtures are not automatically better. The cucumber needs steady conditions first. Once you see how the plant responds to this gentle feeding, you will understand why the next step matters even more, because the mistake most people make after the first feeding is trying to repeat it too soon. After that first gentle feeding, I leave the cucumber alone again for a while because this is where many gardeners lose their patience for the second time. They see the plant getting greener, and suddenly they want to repeat the feeding every few days because it feels good to see quick growth. I understand that feeling because I used to do it myself. But cucumbers do not need a constant stream of fertilizer. They need steady conditions and enough time for the roots to use what you have already given them. I usually watch the new growth for several days before making another decision. If the new leaves are healthy and the stem is stretching normally, I do not add anything. I simply keep the soil evenly moist and make sure the plants are warm at night. This is especially important in a greenhouse because a warm, sunny afternoon can make you think the plant is growing perfectly, while a cold night can quietly stop the roots again. I have learned to pay more attention to the night than the afternoon. If the soil stays cold, the cucumber will not suddenly become stronger because you gave it another feeding. It will simply sit there, waiting for better conditions. And there's another old habit that has saved me a lot of trouble. I never use cold water straight from a deep well on young cucumbers. I fill a container and let the water warm naturally before I use it. It costs nothing, and it is much easier than trying to rescue a plant that has been stressed again and again. Now, let me tell you about another mistake that looks harmless. People often pour the fertilizer right against the stem because they believe that is where the roots are. But young cucumber roots are spreading around the plant, and you do not need to create a concentrated wet spot directly at the stem. I water in a wider circle around the plant so the moisture and feeding reach the root area without keeping the stem constantly wet. This small change also helps me avoid many problems with soft stems and soil staying too wet in one place. And when the cucumber starts growing strongly, I begin looking at something else that tells me whether the feeding is actually working. I do not count leaves, and I do not measure the vine every morning. I look at the color and strength of the new growth. If the leaves are developing normally and the plant is reaching toward its support, then I know I have done enough. If I see a plant producing enormous leaves but barely moving toward flowers later on, I know I pushed it too hard with rich feeding. That is why the old method is not simply about what you put in the soil. It is about knowing when to stop. And the next mistake is even more common because it comes from something almost every gardener has nearby. There is one more thing I learned after years of growing cucumbers, and it has probably saved me more plants than any special fertilizer ever did. I learned to look at the weather before I look at the feeding bucket. If the night is going to be cold or the soil is still cold from several cloudy days, I simply wait. I do not care if the calendar says it is feeding day. A cucumber cannot make good use of feeding when the roots are sitting in cold soil and the plant is already under stress. The same goes for watering. I want the soil moist but not soaked, and I use water that has had time to warm naturally instead of pouring cold water straight from a well or hose onto young roots. This sounds like a small old-fashioned habit, but it makes the whole feeding routine much safer. I have seen two identical cucumber plants receive the same feeding and behave completely differently because one was growing in warm soil and the other was sitting in cold, wet ground. The fertilizer was not the difference. The conditions were. This is why I always say feeding is only one part of the job. You cannot fix cold roots with more fertilizer. You cannot fix poor light with another spoon of nutrients. And you cannot make a stressed plant recover by constantly pouring things around it. First, make the cucumber comfortable and then give it food. Once the first feeding has been given and the plant responds with fresh leaves and stronger growth, I keep the routine simple. I do not keep changing products every few days because every new bottle promises something better. I watch the plant and let it tell me what is happening. If the leaves stay healthy and the vine keeps moving, I leave it alone. If the growth slows, I check moisture warmth and light before reaching for fertilizer again. This habit has saved me money because I no longer feel that every problem needs something bought from a store. Sometimes the best treatment is simply to stop doing too much. And there is another old habit that I think gardeners over 50 will appreciate, because it is almost completely free. Instead of throwing away every bit of healthy organic material from the garden, I return some of it to the soil as a light mulch around the cucumber while keeping it away from the stem. A thin layer helps the soil hold moisture and stay more even through the day. The cucumber grows with less stress, and that means the feeding you already gave it has a better chance to do its job. By now, you may notice that the secret is not one magic ingredient. It is timing warmth, moisture, and restraint working together. But there's still one final mistake I want you to avoid, because it can undo everything we have done so far just when the cucumber begins to grow quickly. By the time the cucumber begins growing strongly, the biggest mistake is usually not a lack of food, but giving too much of it, because the plant finally looks healthy, and the gardener thinks this is the perfect moment to push it even harder. I have made that mistake, and I learned the hard way that a cucumber does not need to be forced when it is already growing well. If the leaves are healthy, the stem is stretching, the tendrils are reaching, and new leaves are opening normally, then the first feeding has done its job. Leave it alone and let the roots continue working. I usually wait until the plant clearly moves into the next stage before giving another feeding, and I never repeat the first ash water simply because several days have passed. This is one of those old habits that sounds almost too simple, but it saves money and keeps the plant from being overloaded. I remember one season when I followed this rule while several gardeners around me were feeding their cucumbers every week with stronger and stronger mixtures. Their plants looked impressive at first with huge leaves and thick green vines, but later many of those plants struggled with flowers while mine kept producing steady new growth. That taught me something I still follow today. A good cucumber plant should not look like it is being pushed. It should look like it is comfortable. So if you have just transplanted your cucumbers, remember the whole routine. Give the roots time to settle for roughly 10 to 14 days depending on the weather. Wait for fresh growth and those small tendrils before feeding. Use a gentle ash water preparation made from clean, untreated wood ash and warm water. Give it around the root area on moist soil and keep the amount modest. Then stop and watch. Do not add fresh manure. Do not pour several fertilizers together, and do not feed when the soil is cold or the plant is stressed. These simple rules cost almost nothing, and they are easy to repeat every season. And that is what I like most about this method, because you do not need a cabinet full of products or a complicated feeding schedule. You need a bucket, some clean ash, warm water, and the patience to let the cucumber tell you what it needs. Once you learn to watch those small signs, the garden becomes much easier. The next time you plant cucumbers, you will probably notice something you never noticed before, and that small change can tell you when the plant is ready for its next important feeding.